This video is about how to have empathy for narcissists. So narcissists don't have empathy or have very low levels of empathy. They really struggle to empathize with people. And this is the reason why they always feel that they're right. They can't empathize with other people's emotions. So if you're trying to communicate with them on an emotional level, they're simply not going to understand where you're coming from. So this is going to cause a lot of pain and struggle and conflict, because particularly in intimate relationships where this is where people have expectations of their partner to have high levels of empathy. It's much easier if it's friendships or more superficial relationships where the expectations are far less for people. But in intimate relationships, the struggle between the sensitive person or person who is an empath and the narcissist is going to be that they really feel that the narcissist is not actually relating to them on an emotional level, not putting themselves in their shoes and not considering their emotions. And this can be extremely painful for people. For many people, it's going to be too painful and they're just going to walk away. They're not going to be able to relate very well to someone who causes them so much pain. And for other people, they are going to put up with it, perhaps because it's familiar to them. Perhaps they grew up in an environment where a parent was very much on this level. A parent was very much a narcissist themselves, and therefore this is something that's either familiar to them or they want to solve the puzzle of it all. Freud has a notion of a repetition compulsion, and this theory is very much about people trying to repeat something in order to get it right. There's a number of different reasons why people would put up with this kind of situation, particularly if it causes them an awful amount of pain. And for other people, they're stuck in the situation. Perhaps it's their parent that's a narcissist and they want to maintain a relationship with that parent, and therefore they put up with this behavior, or they want to try and figure out how to navigate dealing with someone who is quite high on narcissistic traits. So therefore they don't walk away from the situation. It's not always possible for people to walk away from the situation. Perhaps it's a colleague or a boss who's very high on narcissistic traits, and therefore people are trying to figure out how do they empathize, how do they figure out navigating this relationship without having to cut all ties. And I want to really emphasize in this video that not all narcissists are bad. In fact, let's not label narcissists as bad at all. Let's not just say just because someone doesn't have high levels of empathy, it makes them a bad person. And I think there's a lot of videos out there that demonize people who've got narcissistic traits. And I don't want to do that in this video. I want to actually just paint a picture of humans trying to communicate with one another, and what are the difficulties, and how do you actually empathize? How do you see things from different people's perspectives, particularly when someone has those kind of deficits for empathy where they're not really able to relate to people very well on an emotional level. So the thing here is that narcissists, I believe, have deficits in the way that they empathize. Their ability to understand people's emotions, people's emotional world, and put themselves in the shoes of someone else is very much a deficit that they have in their brain. And I'd like to invite people to see this deficit as actually being very similar to autism spectrum disorder, ASD. And the reason I want you to see it like autism spectrum disorder is because if someone has autism spectrum disorder, you know that their deficits in the brain are very permanent and it's not their fault. And you don't try and force them to be another way. And although some people would argue that narcissism comes from trauma and therefore there's kind of almost the pressure on people who have high narcissistic traits to just overcome the trauma. However, there is also an argument that some of this is a personality thing as well, that it's innate in the individual. It's probably a combination of nature and nurture in relation to why someone develops this kind of personality. And of course, there is a spectrum. It's not that someone is, just because someone has high narcissistic traits doesn't mean that they have full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. And definitely, I think for the purpose of this video, what we want to be talking about is, or what we want to be considering is actually people who've perhaps got very high levels of narcissistic traits. However, they're not perhaps meeting the full-blown criteria for NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, because when it gets that bad, perhaps it's just too unhealthy for someone to be in a position where their feelings are disregarded all of the time. So what we're talking about here is a narcissist who lives their life in a really moral way. They're not committing crimes, they're not out to hurt people, they're not intentionally trying to cause harm, but their behavior ends up causing a lot of emotional upset for you because your needs are not being met and you very much have the need to have empathy from this person. So we're most commonly seeing this in intimate relationships, or else we're seeing it in close relationships where people hold ties to this person. So it might be a parent, a sibling, or it might be a boss. We're talking about particularly situations where there's an ongoing communication with this person. You can't cut ties very easily, or for whatever reason you don't want to. Perhaps some of your needs are being met in still having a relationship with this person. So what tends to happen in this dynamic that can often go around in circles for people is that the non-narcissistic individual in this situation feels very hurt, usually on a regular basis, and usually this is a repeated cycle for them. They feel very hurt and they feel a lot of emotional pain from someone who's really high on narcissistic traits. And then the narcissist is completely emotionally blind. So they think that this individual is being unreasonable, that they're not being practical, and essentially that they're making a big deal out of nothing, or they're being a bit silly, or they sometimes might even believe that the person actually likes arguing with them, and that actually they get satisfaction from actually calling this person out on their bad behavior. So what we're seeing is a complete emotional blindness. This individual really does not know what they have done wrong. And I think that's a really important thing to point out here, is that the narcissist who is living their life in a way of good morals, and they are helpful, and they try to be a good person, and they try they're in general living their life just getting along with people fairly well. And it's only where it comes to matters of the heart, or where there's more emotions involved, that's where the conflict is. Then we can kind of assume that this person does not actually know the pain they're causing for people. So the way that I'd like to invite people to have more empathy for the narcissist is to just remember that, and just remember that they just don't know. They can't be any other way. They have deficits in the brain that prevent them from being able to understand your emotions. And they're never going to change. And they're always going to, because of these very real deficits in the brain, they're always going to struggle to operate from a level where they're thinking about your emotions first. So they're always going to think about practical things. They're always going to think about situations that are not related to your emotions. They're just related to what's best for them, what feels good for them, what they want, and operating very much on quite a egocentric level, because they don't have any other place to operate from. They don't really see how it would be beneficial to operate from a place of nurturing your emotions. So when you try to have conversations with them where you're very hurt and angry, and you're trying to explain what they've done wrong, well, first of all, if you're going to be really emotional trying to communicate with them, they're going to find it very hard to communicate with you when you're on that level, because they're going to think you're being very unreasonable. A good way to try and step back from your high levels of emotions in these situations is to, one technique, think of them as a small child, and think of them as a traumatized small child, that it is not their fault that they are this way. These deficits in the brain have happened for a reason, most likely to do with how they've been brought up, as well as we might consider that some of it is a little bit innate as well. But this is like communicating with a small child. You can't reason with them. their behavior is unreasonable to you, your behavior is unreasonable to them, so no one's no one's right here. Let's just put it that way. As much as you might be experiencing a lot of emotional pain from interacting with this person, it's just a case that they see the world from a very different perspective than you, and you live a very emotional world where empathy, kindness is incredibly important, and it feels painful, the fact that they can't see this. So the first thing is just see them as a small child, perhaps a traumatized one, so it's not their fault that they're acting in this way. And the other thing is, I'd like you, as I mentioned before, to see their condition a little bit like other lifelong conditions where there's similar deficits in the brain, like autism spectrum disorder. Of course, their social skills are much better than, they don't have the social skills struggles of someone with autism spectrum disorder, but a lot of the other deficits, like the deficits in terms of empathy and being able to put themselves in your shoes, is going to be along those lines. They'll be fine with sympathy and showing sympathy when it's appropriate. All of that makes sense to them, but actually really empathizing and seeing how their behavior might cause you emotional pain they're going to be blind to this. And it is not their fault that they are this way. Like, it really is not their fault. And a lot of content that is made about narcissists is very much about like how much pain they cause, how awful they are, it demonizes them. And I think that we need to have space to actually not demonize them and just accept that they can't be any other way, and to empathize for that, empathize in relation to their deficits. Like, their deficits cause them a lot of problems. Their deficits cause them a lot of pain. And, and it's not their fault they are this way. And this is a really, really deeply ingrained way of being, so they're not going to change. So if you're going to have a relationship with the narcissist, you kind of have to have the relationship knowing those terms, that they can't change, and trying to, reason with them, trying to beg them to feel empathy for you is an unreasonable ask. And then once you understand this and once you accept it, you can then decide what kind of terms you can have a relationship with them. Is it a case that you decide it's just too painful for you to have an intimate relationship with them, but then you can actually have a friendship with them because your emotional needs are not going to be so strong? Or is it a case that you decide it's just too painful and you just can't have them in your life at all, which is also an okay decision. And I think when you empathize with them, it's going to bring down the intensity of your emotions, because your emotions are going to be really, really intense if you don't see it from the perspective of they can't be any other way and this is not their fault. So to empathize with the narcissist, you just have to keep reminding yourself that they can't be any other way. It's not their fault. They're not intentionally trying to cause harm to you. And that, all types of personality disorders, all types of personalities, you have good people and bad people. And I want to invite people to actually see it the same with people who have very high traits of narcissism. You have very good people who have high traits of narcissism. They're trying to do good and they're trying to, be a good person, and their offerings and intentions are good. They want to try to maintain relationships, and they don't want to cause anyone pain, but they can't necessarily make you feel very good emotionally either. And then we've got, the people who are actually just bad people, as with all types of personalities. There's, there's good people and bad people. So I don't really want people to see all narcissists as being bad narcissists, but at the same time, you have to weigh up the pros and cons here. What are the benefits of having this person in your life? What are the costs of having this person in your life? And how much can you be involved? Like, can you actually have an intimate relationship with a narcissist? Well, if you're a highly sensitive person, probably not. A highly sensitive person is someone who is going to be affected emotionally quite easily. Some of those people have personality disorders such as borderline personality disorder, or perhaps they have very high borderline traits, but they don't meet the full criteria. Other people have absolutely no personality disorder at all, but they are highly sensitive people. And we do tend to have a bit of an opposites attract scenario going on with people who've got very high traits of narcissism. With people who've got high traits of narcissism, they're going to be bound to attract people who have some traits or else completely meet the full-blown criteria for borderline personality disorder. It's rare you would see two highly narcissistic people attracting. However, at the same time, with borderline personality disorder, people with borderline personality disorder can have high traits of narcissism as well, because their judgment gets clouded. When they have high levels of emotion, they tend to see things more from a more egocentric point of view. They tend to see things more from their perspective. And also there's commonalities in the trauma that these two types of people have experienced. So someone who has BPD and someone who has NPD or traits of these disorders tend to actually have core trauma that has similarities. And for that reason, they kind of are speaking the same invisible language when they attract to one another. And this is why we often see these kind of people trying to form relationships with one another. There's something mystical and magical that goes on, that they kind of get each other and understand each other and are excited by each other. And it can be very intense, but it can also cause great chaos for people as well. And you know, the more information people have about people's struggles, the more people can actually make decisions about what they want to do if they are encountering or involved with someone who's got high traits of narcissism. You know, do they walk away, or do they stick around but try to understand this person a little bit more? And again, as I mentioned earlier, just weigh up the pros and cons. Is it more beneficial to have this person in your life? And can you manage the emotional turmoil that it causes for you? Can you manage the pain that it triggers in you when you feel that your emotions are being discarded and pushed to one side? And some people very much can't manage that, and it causes them more chaos and more harm than good. And other people can step aside and realize this is not about them. This person is just operating on a level that is very much to do with how their brain works permanently, and that's how it's gonna continue to be. And therefore they shield themselves a little bit from the lack of empathy that they'll experience when encountering a narcissist. But again, not all narcissists are bad people. They just don't operate from a place of empathy where they're putting themselves in the shoes of other people and considering other people's emotions. But they can be great in all sorts of ways, and you know, they can be helpful, they can be good people, they can be people who are law-abiding and who want those around them to be happy, and they might want harmony and peace, and you know, it's everyone comes with some sort of baggage. And I think that it is the same when people have high traits of narcissism. It is not their fault. They most likely have been through a lot of trauma that has led them to be this way.